Hello, and welcome to this new discussion of the Memory and Future Club of the Association of Former UNESCO staff members. Today, we are pleased to welcome two eminent scholars, Maren Elfert and Christian Ydesen, who have jointly published a book on the global governance of education that gives a well-written and extensively researched account of the historical and contemporary entanglements of UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank, three major international organizations involved with education on the global scene. This is an opportunity to look in particular at the achievements and difficulties of UNESCO's work in this field and exchange ideas on its evolution in a world that has changed rapidly since it was founded 80 years ago. Maren Elfert is a lecturer in the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College in London. She has worked for over a decade at the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in Hamburg. Her research focuses on global governance of education and the influence of international organizations on educational ideas and policies. Maren is also senior advisor and chair of the editorial board of NORAG, the Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training. Christian Ydesen is a professor of international and comparative education at Aalborg University, Denmark, and board member of the Nordic Educational Research Association, NERA. He has extensively investigated the history of the OECD in education and will soon take up the chair in History of Education and Policy Analysis at the University of Zurich. The discussion will be moderated and led by our excellent colleague and friend Alexandra Draxler, who is now an independent consultant on ICT for education and educational sector planning and management. She has a distinguished career at UNESCO and was notably Secretary of the Commission on Education for the 21st Century that produced in 1997 UNESCO's landmark report on education entitled Learning, the Treasure Within. It's up to you, Alexandra.
Hello. Nice to see you, Maren. Nice to see you, Christian. Nice to see you, Neda. Today, the basis of our conversation will be the recent publication of a very interesting book entitled Global Governance of Education, the Historical and Contemporary Entanglements of UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank. This book provides an opportunity to revisit some of the achievements and difficulties of UNESCO's particular work in education. It will also provide a jumping-off point for an exchange about UNESCO's destiny in a world that has changed rapidly since UNESCO was founded. So just to begin, could you both tell us briefly about the origins of this book and at the same time summarize a little bit the rationale and the forces behind the founding of each institution and how this played out in the entanglements, as you call them, or in other words, they're sharing or jockeying for power?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, we found that there's a lot of research on each of the three organizations, but only very sparsely can we find research that brings them all under one analytical lens. In addition, it also became clear that in our combined inventories of archival materials collected from previous research projects, that we would be able to operate across archives from the three organizations, and thereby also conduct a more holistic analysis. And so writing the book also became a good reason to harvest some more interviews with key actors from the three organizations, and even some who operated across the organizational boundaries, like for instance, Jacques Halac, who worked with all three organizations.
The rationale was really that we had so much material, like Christian had this big OECD history of the global history of the OECD in education project. And he had collected a lot of material in the OECD archives, and he also had material from UNESCO, and I had material from UNESCO and a lot of archival sources also from the World Bank. So we thought it would be ideal to really do some analysis of all of this archival material that we had. And we see that there's a lot of interest because there's, as Christian said, there's lots of research on these organizations individually, but not so much about their entanglements, right? And how they work together, how they struggled over turf, how they competed with each other. I could say a little bit about your second aspect, Alexandra, about the origins of these organizations. And so they were all three created after the war, but they came from different traditions and from different fields or agendas, so to speak. So UNESCO was, of course, created as the specialized UN organization for culture, intellectual affairs, education, science, while the World Bank and the OECD came into education later, in the early 1960s, when education became an important factor or was promoted as an important factor of economic growth. And so the World Bank emerged from the Bretton Woods Conference. And although it was associated with the UN, it was always concerned about its independence and belongs more to the business world, right? To the financial world of Wall Street. And the OECD was established to administer the Marshall Plan. So again, a completely different agenda. And we have to look also at their different mandates. So UNESCO's mandate is peacekeeping, intellectual cooperation, whereas the OECD's mandate was always economic growth. And the World Bank was initially created for the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, but then shifted towards developing countries. And they also have different ways of governing, of knowledge brokering. UNESCO has these general conference resolutions and is more normative, and the World Bank governs more through benchmarking, and is also more self-referential, more, what works. And that's then kind of applied to the member states, whereas the OECD more frequently references other countries, the peer reviewing, kind of peer learning, right? And you said, Alexandra, at one point that about the transactional relationships. So especially the World Bank has more transactional relationships with its member states, but also the OECD to some extent, because the member states pay for PISA. Whereas UNESCO is arguably, and we also say that in our book, the most democratically really governed organization, where there's one vote, one country in the General Conference.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I might add, of course, that as you both know that and have written about, that the OECD came to education and its interest in education through the economic sphere. And the educators at the OECD had to convince the overall OECD leadership of the economic value of education, although they weren't necessarily committed only to that. Quoting from your book, UNESCO's history is characterized precisely by the tensions deriving from its role as an organization with a strong normative mandate, which is often at odds with the dominant managerial principles of effectiveness and accountability. This has played out over the years as strengthening a so-called utilitarian approach to the purposes of education, with UNESCO retaining its focus on individual fulfillment. Can you comment on this slight tension, we might call it?
Yes, I think, at first sight, and certainly in the contemporary situation, the three organizations might actually seem to be rather aligned at first sight, because when you look at how these three organizations actually seem to come together about the Sustainable Development Goals. For instance, they formed the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning in 2016 to support the production of learning indicators and assessment tools for monitoring the progress of SDG 4. But however, when you sort of scratch the surface a little bit, a different and perhaps more competitive picture emerges. So I think this sort of conundrum can be explained by the fact that the three organizations have different starting points in the approaches to education, as Maren already explained and also implied in the quote there. So I would say that education sort of takes a starting point in education as such. That is, what is education? What do we want education to be? And what are the purposes of education? And perhaps also in a sort of broader context, how education can serve to create a better world. So UNESCO very much sees education as a common good, whereas the OECD and the World Bank tends to take a starting point in the economy and then ask questions like how education can serve to improve and sustain the economy, and what are the economic benefits to be harvested from education. So I think that's some of the key distinctions.
Yes, and of course, many of our listeners, and you too, will of course remember that the World Bank actually developed rates of return for various levels of education and used that as a convincing calculus for why all children should be in school. The World Bank and UNESCO had from 1964 to 1989 a cooperation agreement similar to that with other UN agencies. The World Bank was the funder, and the expertise and rationale were outsourced to experts of another institution, in this case, UNESCO, but also UNICEF, WHO, and so forth. Over time, the World Bank found it practical and convenient to bring its expertise home and to develop its expertise in-house, which of course gave it more power in allocating funding. And of course, it drained UNESCO of not only of practical experience in managing and evaluating huge projects, but also of clout in decision-making about these projects. In addition to that, do you think that this breaking off of the relationship between the World Bank and UNESCO ultimately had a negative impact on UNESCO's own in-house expertise?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Alexandra. This research about the UNESCO World Bank Cooperative Program, which ran from 1964 to officially 1989, although it already phased out since the late 1970s, really. That was really interesting. We wrote about that in chapter 4 of our book. And it was really interesting because many people don't know about this cooperative program. They actually don't know that how closely these two organizations work together.
Right.
And so your question about did the decline of this collaboration have a negative impact on UNESCO's in-house expertise? Many of my interviewees said that. They emphasized that. After that was phased out, it didn't die immediately. It transitioned into the Division for Policy and Sector Analysis initially, which was institutionally situated outside of the education sector. And that was always the problem also with the Education Financing Division, that it was independent. And so it was perceived as a Trojan horse because it was not under the control of the education sector. And the same happened with the successor division, with the PSA. And then in the mid-1990s, there was another division created that picked up the leftovers, basically, from the Education Financing Division. But then after a few more years, it faded away as well. And it was never popular. But when UNESCO let its competencies decline in sector analysis and this kind of technical work, operational work, decline, it left the field to the World Bank. So as observed by Stephen Heinemann in his 2003 paper, by the 1990s, the bank virtually had the field of education policy to itself. And at the root of this are tensions among the staff, but also the member states, about the role and the mandate of UNESCO. And that goes back to the creation of UNESCO. This has always been a contested topic. Should UNESCO just be normative, or should it also do more operational and technical work? And in any case, UNESCO made it easy for the World Bank to get overtaken by it. And in my view, being a normative organization does not necessarily mean that there doesn't have to be professional know-how. There's also other domains, actually, where I've been told, or I've seen myself, that UNESCO has been a bit deprofessionalized. And also the other aspect of this is that all of this operational, the sector analysis work goes to, has now basically is the IAP that does it, the International Institute for Educational Planning, which in our book we describe as a boundary organization, because it allows for the World Bank, for example, and other organizations to still collaborate with UNESCO, but it goes through the IIEP. And so just to say this, some of my interviews have very much emphasized that UNESCO was deprofessionalized by these developments.
Perhaps a small point to add here, it's more like a reflection perhaps, is that the salaries and conditions at the World Bank and the OECD tend to be better than in UNESCO. So there might also be some kind of pull factor, like causing like a brain drain from UNESCO, perhaps.
And that's a good point, Christian, because that was also pointed out to me by some of my interviewees, that many of the UNESCO staff never really liked that World Bank UNESCO division, because they traveled under World Bank conditions. You know, they had so they, yeah, exactly. But another reason was also that the Soviet Union, which was of course a member of UNESCO, also did not particularly like that division, because it was associated with the United States, with the World Bank, with capitalism, and so on.
Correct. Yeah. Since I was there at the time, I remember all these things, and I can absolutely endorse them.
Yeah.
Well, doing the positive, could you point to a few areas where you think that UNESCO has made a singular impact on education and development? We know that UNESCO did not at all reject the idea of education being a tool of economic development, but it was never its first mission or its first area of interest, really. So what would you point to as UNESCO's unique contributions?
I mean, in a historical perspective, I think that UNESCO really did have an impact through its comprehensive education for peace programs back in the 1950s. But I mean, that was then, you know, and there's not so much talk about that nowadays. I would suggest something that might be a bit surprising, perhaps even a bit controversial in terms of discussing UNESCO's impact, because I think a considerable impact emerged from the facilitation of the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, the IEA, which started its activities in the UNESCO Institute for Education in Hamburg. And that really became a laboratory for the development of international large-scale assessments, comparative work, comparative indicators even, and the methodologies behind the international large-scale assessments. And those were the methodologies that obviously were picked up by Andreas Schleicher and then sort of transferred into the OECD and the development of PISA decades later. So in a way, one might say that the UNESCO Institute for Education was instrumental in opening up a Pandora's box that would eventually transform education into something completely different. Probably not with the good intention of UNESCO, but I mean, sometimes, you know, you have these unintended consequences in the historical trajectories.
I might add, and you may or may not have highlighted this in the book because I don't remember, but UNESCO's normative work very much in the early days also focused on terminology, not just data, but also on terminology. UNESCO was the first institution to develop an international language of how to talk about education. And that has been kept up over the years and amplified and contributed to and by other institutions, but it was UNESCO's initiative. And probably because it had this truly international mandate that we had to agree on primary education meaning the same thing to policymakers all over the world so that they could talk to each other. Would you agree, Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. And certainly that also was picked up by the OECD and the World Bank. So in that sense, the UNESCO really was the norm-setting kind of organization in determining what are we actually talking about, right? But I think the other two organizations then, they realized in a way that they had to create their own data. They needed to harvest their own data. They could not rely on countries adhering to certain definitions in terms of delivering data. So they took it all in-house, and that has really been instrumental in terms of understanding the authority that they wield today, because they have much more data than any country would have, right? So I think that's also part of the explanation why countries keep participating in PISA and other programs, because they dare not opt out, even though we do see some signs around the world of PISA fatigue and other things that, you know, maybe is it also worth it from a cost benefit analysis perspective?
Absolutely.
But still, it seems that, you know, the juggernaut is still there, the super tanker is still going, right, and reinventing itself perhaps also.
First of all, I would like to mention UNESCO's work on lifelong learning. UNESCO has done arguably the most substantial conceptual and theoretical work on the concept of lifelong learning, also with the two commission reports, the FOR report in 1972, the Delors report in 1996, and has always been the flag bearer of the lifelong learning perspective, adult education, non-formal education, which I think is very important. And also I'm always been impressed by, when I do archival work, for example, research in UNESCO, by all of the intellectual work that has been going on. There is just so much, so many reports and meetings and issues that have been discussed. It's such a rich source, really, of intellectual work in education and beyond. And many of my interviewees over time have also referred to several initiatives. So, for example, I remember the interview that I did with Henri Lopez, who was one of the members of the FOR Commission. And he started our interview with the very good reputation that UNESCO has in his country, in Congo, because of the training, the teacher training colleges that it started after the country had become independent. And also, UNESCO has always had a mediating role. For example, always tried to bring in the civil society perspective into the Education for All process, which was absent in the Fast Track Initiative, for example, which was kind of the financial arm, which was coordinated by the World Bank. So there's maybe not one single thing, not one single project that I would emphasize, but yeah, several of these, and in particular, UNESCO's always strong promotion of the lifelong learning perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So I come to another question, which is something that we talked about the other day, and it's the last really substantive question. It's a peer into the future. Two concurrent paradigmatic changes in global governance over the last years have been, first, the role of the for-profit private sector in arguably weakening state monopoly in countries all over the world over norms and standards, over national policies, and over the functioning of educational systems. And the other paradigmatic change is the expansion of civil society, the very, very strong expansion of civil society, or what's called the third sector, both within and across national boundaries, blurring to some extent the boundaries between democracy, profit, and the public good. We used to think of the state as being the main interlocutor for these things. And it's that I suppose that monopoly is falling apart to some extent. And the UNESCO Constitution makes it exclusively answerable to governments. And as a consequence, UNESCO is being put under some strain because I still refer to UNESCO as we, is still mainly responsible to governments and mainly functions with the idea that governments are the first people you talk to. So going forward, could you attempt to peer into the future of UNESCO a little bit? How can UNESCO face these challenges, both to the whole notion of collective international governance and these challenges to its mandate, its pertinence, and its effectiveness?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, of course. I think a key finding of the book is that global education today finds itself in a regime of multi-stakeholderism. So the implication is that accountability thereby becomes very slippery, not least because of corporate secrecies and the myriad of actors, interests, agendas, funds, technologies, and data that's out there. I think on reflection that an international organization's strength to some extent lies in its mandate. And in that sense, I would claim that UNESCO remains unavoidable when it comes to global education. But perhaps more importantly, the strength and the importance of an international organization also rests on the support of its members, its constituency. So the currency here is credibility and relevance. I think because of Sustainable Development Goal number 4, UNESCO has gained in importance after a long desert journey, you could say, in an optimistic tone perhaps. But given the increasingly apparent problems with reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, there's also a need to reinvent the organization. The OECD historically has always been brilliant at that, reinventing itself. UNESCO seems to be trying to, I think, with its Futures of Education initiative and new institutions like the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. But that's also part of a geopolitical struggle, right?
Right.
I think there's also an imminent risk that UNESCO will be made to serve other agendas and geopolitical interests because of tight money and asymmetric partnerships. This is especially true in a world under rapid reconstruction in terms of geopolitical shifts, as I said. And there are also some cultural clashes both between and within nation states, the anti-woke movement and other things like that, increased polarization. I think a crucial development that we see now that might have a really big role and influence in the future is what has been called the neuroaffective turn, encompassing gene learning, precision learning, neurobiology, neuroscience, neuropedagogy, which is really about how you translate research findings on neural mechanisms of learning to educational practice and policy, and also to understand the effects of education on the brain. I think that whole wave, with its firm rooting in the life sciences and the vast funds and economic interests behind that agenda, it's something that UNESCO will have to work out how to deal with. And one might ask, perhaps provocatively, is UNESCO's best hope for the future to adopt the newest shiny object? I think the recurrent challenge for UNESCO is to find a role as a meaningful forum where different interests can come together and find good and common solutions. I guess that was, of course, always the purpose with UNESCO, although one may question if such a goal has ever been achieved, but because poor funding was always the Achilles heel of UNESCO. I think UNESCO really needs to consider how to boost its reputation as a credible and relevant partner for member states and partners. That's crucial and more needed than ever. UNESCO, hopefully, but that's again perhaps the historian speaking, that perhaps UNESCO can invoke its long history in struggling for creating some kind of we for elucidating the possibilities and pitfalls, while at the same time recognizing that the creation of a we in today's post-colonial setting requires really profound involvement and recognition of all stakeholders and generally everyone affected. And to end a bit on a positive note, I think UNESCO in many ways are better positioned to achieve that than the OECD and the World Bank, because UNESCO's composition of capital and authority differs significantly from the other two organizations. So in different words, in other words, UNESCO has different cards on its hand that it can play, perhaps, but it's not going to be easy.
Thank you. And Maren?
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the multi-stakeholderism that Christian mentioned. and about the rise of the non-state and especially the corporate actors in UNESCO and other international organizations and global governance of education more broadly. And as you said, constitutionally, relationships with the private sector, and I have that point from you because you pointed that out to me once, are only foreseen if those partners, and I quote from the Constitution, pursue goals that are in conformity with UNESCO's ideals and are entirely non-profit making. So there is definitely a problem here. And given that UNESCO has always been under financial constraints, it is particularly vulnerable to seeking extra budgetary funds and the tied money that Christian mentioned, which is of course a problem for the independence of the organization if the money is tied to the interests that the member states want to pursue, or the corporations or whatever foundations that give this money. And just to say a few more words about the point that Christian made about the geopolitics, right? The future of international organizations and the global governance or intergovernmental space is, of course, linked to broader geopolitical developments. And to be fair, UNESCO has not fared particularly well under the age of American hegemony because the United States chose to work with to prioritize other international organizations,
right,
such as the World Bank and the OECD. So maybe now that China is rising in influence in the organization, maybe that will change things for UNESCO. That is a possibility. But my tendency would be that the multilateral order that was established after World War II and of which UNESCO is a part is in decline more generally. So with this shift from multilateralism to multi-stakeholderism that Christian already mentioned, and where these private and philanthropic actors are invited into the intergovernmental space. And we also see, in my view, a shift from the order of international law to a rules-based order, where basically the most powerful makes the rules. So I think UNESCO will continue to exist, definitely, because UNESCO has this legitimacy as the UN organization. I think it will continue to exist, but it might only be one organization among many. And lose some of its intellectual independence. So I think we're not in a very rosy situation in that regard.
Well, thank you both, and I really think there needs to be no important comment. Both of you seem to me to be speaking about the very, very important role of UNESCO as an international forum where everybody's voice counts. And Christian said in one very powerful way, and Maren in a different way, that what UNESCO really needs to do is reimagine this forum and make it a more powerful one. And that it's not up to us to tell UNESCO how to run itself. You've written an amazing book that is a wonderful read for anybody who's even remotely interested in international cooperation.
I'm left with thanking Alexandra Draxler for taking us through this excellent exchange, and Maren, Elfert and Christian Ydesen for sharing with our audience their in-depth research into this complex issue. If you'd like to take your thought further, be sure to read their book on global governance of education. They have also jointly contributed to a special issue of the International Journal of Educational Development on critical perspectives at the midpoint of the SDG 4, Progress, Promises, and Pitfalls. It is available online at the page showing on your screen. You can also find previous interviews on the AFUS website on the Memory and Future Club page by following this link. Thank you for watching this video, and goodbye.